Michael Dawson had always lived for the thrill of discovery. After retiring from a career in aviation, he found solace in exploring the wilderness, embarking on solitary hikes that tested his endurance. Silver Pines, his quiet village nestled in the valley below Mount Eldridge, was the perfect base for his adventures. The mountain, steeped in mystery and folklore, loomed above the village like a sentinel, its jagged peaks often shrouded in mist. The villagers rarely ventured beyond the lower slopes, whispering tales of disappearances, ancient relics, and strange occurrences that made Mount Eldridge infamous. Planes were said to have gone down in its heights, never to be seen again. But Michael, pragmatic and seasoned, dismissed these stories as the exaggerations of superstitious minds. To him, mountains were challenges to be conquered, not mysteries to be feared, so, one brisk autumn morning, he decided to embark on a solo expedition to the peak of Eldridge, a place few dared to venture. With his backpack stocked with supplies, a sturdy walking stick, and the air crisp with the scent of pine, Michael began his ascent just as the sun crested the horizon. For the first few hours, the climb was peaceful, almost meditative. The rustling leaves and distant chirps of mountain birds were the only sounds to accompany his steady pace. The path was rugged but manageable, with a mix of sharp inclines and narrow ridges that tested his footing. Occasionally, he'd stop to admire the view, Silver Pines now a tiny, picturesque speck far below him, but as noon approached and he climbed higher, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, as if the mountain itself were exhaling icy breath. The mist thickened, curling around him in ghostly tendrils, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees, once vibrant with autumn colors, now appeared gnarled and dark, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. It was then that Michael felt the first twinge of unease. He had ventured into remote, rugged landscapes before, but something about this mountain felt different. The silence was no longer serene. It was oppressive, suffocating. The usual forest sounds had vanished, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very world was holding its breath. Despite his growing discomfort, Michael pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his unease. He was too far along to turn back now. As he rounded a bend near the upper reaches of the mountain, something caught his eye, a glint of metal through the mist. He paused, squinting through the fog. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe a boulder catching the sun, but no. It was too angular, too deliberate. With his heart pounding faster, Michael pushed through the thick underbrush, his breath clouding in the cold air. The terrain became more treacherous, the path narrowing until it was barely a trail at all. The mist was dense now, swirling around him like a living thing, and the cold bit into his skin despite his heavy jacket. Then he saw it, between two jagged cliffs, half hidden by the overgrowth of time, was the unmistakable silhouette of an aircraft. The fuselage, though weathered and battered, still bore the unmistakable lines of a plane from an era long past. Its once sleek body was now rusted and streaked with grime. Its nose slightly buried in the rocky earth, as if it had come to rest here decades ago and simply been forgotten. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He took a step closer, and the scope of it hit him. This wasn't just any plane, it was an old twin-engine craft, likely from the 1950s or 60s. Its wings, though still mostly intact, were bent and twisted, their edges fringed with rust. One of the propellers hung limply, as though it had been twisted in a hard landing, and the cockpit windows were shattered, their glass jagged and frosted with grime. His mind raced. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? Eldridge had its legends of planes going missing in the mists, but none of them were recent enough to match this era. What was this doing here, so far from any known flight paths? And why was there no record of it? Michael approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the loose gravel beneath him. The air around the wreck felt different, colder, almost suffocating, as though the mountain itself disapproved of his presence. His breath came in shallow, frosty puffs, but his hands trembled not from the cold, but from a growing sense of dread. The plane was eerily silent, as though time had frozen it in place. The trees around it seemed to bend inward, their branches leaning over the wreckage like mourners at a grave. As he drew closer, Michael noticed that the vegetation around the plane was overgrown, but strangely stunted. Vines wrapped around the fuselage like tendrils, but they were dead, brittle, as though the very earth had rejected life here. There was something wrong with this place. His eyes scanned the plane, noting the lack of visible damage. There were no scorch marks, no signs of an explosion or fire, nothing to suggest a crash landing. It was as if the plane had simply stopped, frozen in time, and yet, the fact remained, the plane should not be here. Michael hesitated at the door, a heavy metal hatch that hung slightly ajar. He felt the coldness emanating from the inside and a strange, almost imperceptible pressure in his ears, like the kind felt before a storm. He pushed the door open further with a creak that echoed through the silent valley. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with the stale scent of age. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the remnants of leather seats were torn and sagging, their stuffing spilling out in dusty piles. The plane's controls lay covered in grime, the dials cracked, and the instrument panel flickering faintly as though it were powered by some unseen force. Michael's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. Stepping cautiously inside, he found himself in the main cabin, which was eerily intact. Dust-covered papers and magazines lay scattered across the floor, and an old suitcase was wedged between two seats, its contents spilled out, a yellow dress, a pair of shoes. Michael reached down and picked up a folded piece of paper from the seat beside the co-pilot's chair. His hands shook as he unfolded it, revealing what appeared to be a passenger manifest. His eyes scanned the names, but nothing stood out. Then he saw the last entry, Project Erebus. Authorized personnel only. A chill shot down his spine. The name stirred something in his memory, something long buried. Project Erebus had been whispered about during his days in the military, but only in the vaguest terms. Pilots spoke of it as an urban legend, a secret mission involving experimental aircraft, but no one ever had any concrete details. All he knew was that planes associated with Project Erebus had a reputation for vanishing without a trace. Michael's mouth went dry. Was this one of those planes? If so, what had it been doing up here, on this remote, forgotten mountain? Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. His pulse quickened. The tapping seemed to come from deeper inside the plane. He stood frozen, straining to hear, but the sound faded, leaving only silence. His rational mind told him it was just the wind, perhaps a branch tapping against the fuselage. But a deeper, primal part of him, the part that had kept him alive during his years as a pilot, warned him that something wasn't right. He turned toward the cockpit, his heart hammering in his chest. The cold was more intense now, seeping into his bones. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the broken windows like an impenetrable wall. The shadows inside the plane seemed to stretch and writhe, as if the darkness itself was alive. Michael reached the cockpit door and hesitated. A strange humming sound filled the air, low and rhythmic, like the droning of distant machinery. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was in there. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed the cockpit door open. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The cockpit was a ghostly tableau, frozen in time, and yet somehow alive. The seats were empty, the control panel dusted with decades of grime, but the instruments, those cracked and faded dials, were moving. Spinning. The hands twitched erratically, the altimeter flickering between impossible heights and depths, the compass whirring in confused circles, and the air was thick with something he couldn't place. It wasn't just the musty staleness of a forgotten relic. No, it felt oppressive, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His ears popped again, but this time the pressure didn't fade. It intensified, then he saw it, etched into the dashboard, half hidden under layers of grime. Was a single word scratched into the metal, "Help." Michael staggered backward, his mind reeling. Someone, something, had been here. But how? The plane had clearly been abandoned for decades. His head spun with questions, each more chilling than the last. Suddenly, a metallic clank echoed through the fuselage, loud and deliberate. The hairs on his arms stood on end. It was no longer the rhythmic tapping from earlier, it was closer, more deliberate. He whipped his flashlight around, casting jagged beams of light through the cockpit, but the shadows seemed to swallow it whole. Something was moving. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone, the cold inside the plane deepened to a near unbearable degree. His breath came in short, visible puffs, clouding in front of him as the walls of the plane groaned under some unseen weight. The windows were thick with fog, and yet, something moved outside them. Dark, indistinct shapes, just beyond the glass, swayed in and out of the mist, but no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't make out any form. It was like trying to see through a veil of thick smoke, with shadows flickering on the other side. Then, in the faint light from his flickering flashlight, he noticed a flight log, still wedged between the co-pilot's seat and the control panel. The pages were yellowed and brittle with age, but the handwriting was surprisingly clear. Michael skimmed the entries. At first, they seemed ordinary: weather reports, flight paths, mechanical checks. But as he neared the end, the entries became erratic, the writing jagged and panicked, clouds shifting against the wind. Altitude fluctuation severe. Instruments not responding. Michael swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he turned to the final page. The last entry was scrawled in a hurried hand, the ink smeared as if the writer had been trembling. "We've crossed into something else. Instruments useless. Can't reach base. The sky is wrong. Something is in here with us." He felt a jolt of terror at the final sentence. His eyes darted around the cockpit as if expecting to see whatever had been with the crew back then. But the space was empty. Silent, and then a voice, soft, faint, barely a whisper, "Help." The single word seemed to echo in the small space, though it was almost too quiet to hear. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He whipped his head around, eyes wide, searching for the source. The voice was unmistakably human, but there was something wrong with it. The sound seemed fragmented, like a recording played through a broken speaker. "Help me." It came again, louder this time, and Michael realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't even coming from the cockpit, it was inside his head. "Get out," he whispered to himself, forcing his legs to move. "Get out of here now." But as he turned to leave, the radio on the dashboard crackled to life with a burst of static. Michael froze. The old, broken radio hadn't worked in decades, yet here it was, spitting out bursts of garbled sound. His flashlight flickered in response, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The static grew louder, rising to a deafening pitch. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. His head throbbed as the static filled the cockpit, vibrating the very air around him. Then, through the noise, he heard it. A voice. Not the same soft whisper from before, this one was deep, distorted, almost mechanical. "We should not have come this way." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The voice crackled and broke, cutting in and out of the static, but it was unmistakably human. And yet, it was wrong, warped, hollow, as if it were being dragged across some great distance, distorted by time itself. Project Erebus. Failed. Michael's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Project Erebus, it was a myth, a ghost story from his military days, a Black Ops mission so secret that even its pilots didn't know what they were flying into. The few who returned weren't the same. Some said they'd gone mad, others claimed they'd been changed by what they'd seen, but most simply never came back. The door. The voice crackled again, this time lower, almost drowned by the static. It was not meant to be opened. Suddenly, the entire plane shuddered violently, nearly knocking Michael off his feet. The controls on the dashboard lit up with blinding intensity, the dials spinning wildly, gauges fluctuating between extremes that no plane should have been able to withstand. The lights flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows as the walls seemed to close in on him, and then the static stopped. Silence, complete and oppressive, fell over the cockpit. Michael stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body rigid with fear. For a moment, nothing moved. The plane stood still, as if the very air around it had been sucked away, leaving only a suffocating void. And then, the voice returned. Soft. Barely a whisper, "Get out." This time, Michael didn't hesitate. He bolted for the exit, shoving the cockpit door open so hard it slammed against the wall with a crash. His boots pounded against the metal floor as he raced through the cabin, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The plane seemed to groan in protest, the walls vibrating with a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the fuselage. As he reached the door, something stopped him in his tracks. A cold, invisible force gripped him, holding him in place, as if the plane itself was refusing to let him leave. His breath caught in his throat, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he felt as though the very air had turned solid around him, trapping him inside. "Help us." The scream tore through his mind with such intensity that he cried out, clutching his head. The voices, hundreds of them, overlapping, screaming, begging, filled his mind, drowning out every rational thought. It was like a flood of desperation, panic, and fear, as if the souls of everyone who had ever been trapped in this place were reaching out to him, pulling him back into the depths. With a primal scream, Michael yanked himself free, the force breaking like a dam. He stumbled forward, flinging himself through the open door, and fell hard onto the ground outside. The cold, damp earth was a shock to his system, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his legs burning with the effort as he tore through the trees, not daring to look back. The fog seemed to chase him, swirling in thick, suffocating waves, but he didn't stop. He ran until his lungs screamed for air, until his legs felt like they were going to give out beneath him. Finally, after what felt like hours, he collapsed against a rock, gasping for breath. His body trembled with exhaustion, and his mind raced with the horror of what had just happened. He glanced back toward the direction of the plane, half expecting to see it looming behind him, but the fog had swallowed it whole. The wreck was gone, vanished into the mist as if it had never existed. Michael sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the swirling fog. The mountain was silent once again, the oppressive cold lifting ever so slightly, but something deep inside him had shifted. He knew that plane was still there, waiting. It would always be waiting. Hidden in the mountain, a relic of something far older and far darker than he had ever imagined, he knew, without a doubt, that others would come. Others would hear the stories. Others would seek it out. But he would never return. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed.